Welcome to this week's episode of the Inside Kingston podcast, where experienced professionals, entrepreneurs, and community leaders based in Kingston upon Thames are invited on to share their story with us. I'm your host, Amir Rochalina.
This week's episode of the Inside Kingston podcast is brought to you by Holland Harnham Wills, a financial planning and wealth management firm based in Kingston upon Thames. Holland Harnham Wills specialises in retirement planning for senior professionals and successful business owners. Visit hhw-uk.com to start feeling more relaxed and confident about your financial future.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. I'm joined today by Elliot Newton. Elliot is the Biodiversity Officer for the Royal Borough of Kingston upon Thames and the co-founder of Citizen Zoo, a social enterprise aiming to inspire Kingston residents about the wonderful natural wonders that surround us. What's unique about Elliot is how he and his team are engaging with our community to improve local green spaces and nature reserves. And be sure to listen to the end, where Elliot shares with us how you can get involved in local conservation projects as well. So whether you're interested in knowing more about rewilding and conservation, or would like to know more about what it takes to run a successful community project, then I hope you enjoy this episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. Welcome, Elliot Newton, to the Inside Kingston podcast. Elliot, I'm really excited about this conversation because I think it's really important for us to raise awareness of the biodiversity and green spaces which are right here on our doorstep. And I think our listeners can learn a lot from your expertise in this area. But to kick off this conversation, I'd like to go back in time, if that's okay. So, Elliot, where did you grow up?
Oh, well, thank you for having me on, Amir. But yeah, so I'm a Kingston person, born and bred. I was born actually in Kingston Hospital and yeah, went to primary schools, local primary schools. I spent a bit of time when I was very young. My dad went off to America and to sort of north of England for little parts of time. So I spent little part times travelling around there. But most of my upbringing, the significant part of it was growing up in Kingston, running around and exploring our sort of greener spaces that we have to offer here.
Very cool. And it's a lovely part of the world to grow up in, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Absolutely. I think it really has sculpted my sort of fascination for nature and knowledge of wildlife, which is quite peculiar because when people think of Kingston, you don't normally think of nature and wildlife, but for me, it's the first thing that sort of springs into my head.
Very cool, very cool. And Elliot, did you go to university? And if so, what did you study?
Yeah, so I actually, well, as a child growing up, even though I had a fascination in nature, I wasn't really aware of the job opportunities that might bring. And my passion at the time was human biology and sort of sports science. So my first degree was actually in sports science at the University of Birmingham, but my insatiable sort of passion for nature carried on burning through. And then after graduating from that, I started to explore other ways in which I could formalise my education in sort of natural sciences and ecology. So I did a postgraduate diploma at Edinburgh in ecology, and then I went to Imperial to do a master's in conservation science, and and did a few little bits here and there. But yeah, so that was the university route. Very cool, man. That sounds really interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about your career journey before you set up Citizen Zoo? Yeah, so again, I suppose I had like conservation is actually a really interesting field. When you talk to many people within the sort of conservation sector, it's amazing sort of the multidisciplinary sort of backgrounds that people come from. It's very rare you find somebody working in conservation who's been doing conservation their entire life, which is quite good because that gives it quite a sort of a fresh sort of approach, and you get lots of different skill sets and backgrounds to benefit from. So I had a relatively diverse career sort of journey before really settling into conservation, which included, well, for example, when I was at university first time around, I was part of the university air squadron and was meant to be going into the RAF to hopefully explore some piloting, which I managed to do a little bit, but then sort of moved away from that. And then I also worked on the ambulances as a sort of an ambulance technician for 4 years. So not quite a paramedic, but just below. Very cool. And then so did did that for a good few years, and also did that while studying for my ecology sort of stuff as well.
Yeah. So if we bring this conversation to the present, there's two things I want to talk to you about here, because you're obviously the co-founder of Citizen Zoo, which I think is a thread I want to pull first, if you don't mind. But then also I want to talk to you about your role as the Biodiversity Officer for Kingston Council, because I think our listeners will get a lot from that. But firstly, could you tell us a little bit about Citizen Zoo?
Yeah, so Citizen Zoo is it's a community interest company, and it's relatively new. We sort of founded it when we were doing our sort of masters in 2014, 2015. So it's a relatively new organisation, and what it's sort of got two main fundamental themes. One is it's about the power of rewilding, and rewilding is a really new sort of concept that's been coming out pretty much over the last 20 years. It's really been getting into its pace, which is all about how we can bring nature back into our landscapes, but not just only into our planet, because obviously our planet is severely nature depleted at the moment, but also trying to bring nature back into people's lives and sort of rewild people's minds and reconnect them to nature, which brings so many positive and sort of well-being benefits to your psychological and to your physical well-being. So that was one sort of sphere that with sort of Citizen Zoo was looking into. And the other thing that was very much focused on community-led conservation. So, you know, the world is, as we say, in significant trouble. And if we're really going to try and solve the problems that we have facing us globally, I think we need a sort of holistic, widespread, inclusive movement that brings everybody with us. And so we strongly believe that anybody can be a conservationist if they're given the right sort of skill set and motivation and just feel like they're empowered to do so. So we really thought there was a lot more that could be achieved in terms of mobilising local people to engage with rather pioneering conservation work. So we thought if we could try and bring together sort of these grassroots solutions and sort of leading science, leading sort of conservation, marry the two into some like sort of melting pot. And we thought that, you know, that is a really sort of positive way in which we go about trying to do some good environmental and conservation work locally.
Yeah, I love that, man. I really do, especially this concept of starting from the bottom up and just getting support from volunteers and folks that are interested in this or passionate about this themselves, and then starting to get the message out there so that people who aren't even aware of the green spaces or the conservation projects that are happening in the area going, oh, wow, I'd love to be part of that. And I just want to focus on one word you used there, because in preparation for this chat, Elliot, I came across for the first time, I've got to admit, this concept of rewilding people. So I'm familiar with the concept of rewilding mammals, right? And the way you sort of reintroduce, especially big mammals, back into, you know, the African savannas or something like that. But it really struck me when I read rewilding people. You know, when you have a feeling in your mind, but you've never attached it to a word or a sentence, that's exactly how I felt like with that. I went, oh yeah, absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. And I know you've run even a conferences on rewilding. So would you mind just expanding a little bit about on the word, on the concept behind it?
Yeah, well, rewilding is a really interesting concept, I think, because like any sort of new emerging concept, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So as you say, rewilding typically was applied sort of in the American context in sort of the 90s, where people were looking at these big carnivores, massive landscapes, big sort of corridors, like sort of the Yellowstone, Yosemite sort of areas. And that was where it sort of stayed. But now we're seeing it's being applied to a whole range of different contexts. So I'm a big fan personally of urban rewilding and how we can try and make our urban environments more resilient in terms of our approach to climate change and more supporting more green infrastructure and stuff like that. But as you say, I think one of the most exciting things, to my point, around rewilding is rewilding of people and trying to, you know, just bring nature back into people's lives. I think we all suffer from various sort of disconnections with nature. There's a phrase which is called nature deficit disorder, which is used quite commonly to just describe how people are not really engaging with nature as much as we should, and then the sort of the ills that come from that. So this is something we really think is so important, especially in an urban context where we might not feel like we have access to nature. It's so much easier to become not connected with it, and there's so many scary statistics out there. For example, and there's a relatively recent statistic which said that 3/4 of all our children spend less time outdoors than our average prison inmate. Wow. So these are real sort of chronic sort of issues that face our society. However, the good thing about it is I think we're currently in quite a poor position in terms of how much we engage with nature from a community level and how much illiteracy we have, so we don't really understand what's around us. So we're starting at quite a low baseline, but that means I think there's so much potential there to sort of bring nature back into people's lives, get them outside. Hopefully that's something lockdown has done. People might have explored their local space more than they would have otherwise, and just finding some of the natural wonders that also call Kingston home. So I'm a fundamental believer in people will not be able to care about something they do not know. So we have to get them to know through that, know and become aware of the amazing natural heritage that we have around us, and then you can start using that interest to try and inspire value and then potentially action, which can then hopefully bring some really positive sort of conservation and environmental outputs. I think I love telling people about nature more than actually sometimes experiencing nature myself, just seeing that fire light up in people's eyes.
It's so cool and so important. I'm biased, but I was, fortunate enough to grow up in a rural part of Brazil, and having been outdoors and exploring nature, just came fairly naturally, luckily. And there's so much to see on that front in and around Kingston and just England as a whole, or the world as a whole. All you need is, as you said, that once that fire is lit, it's just incredible. Let me just segue this conversation slightly to your other position, Elliot, because obviously if Citizen Zoo wasn't enough to keep you busy, you're also the Biodiversity Officer for Kingston Council. Could you tell us a little bit more about that role?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually a new role to Kingston Council, so it's really exciting. And it's part of sort of council's organisational sort of priority that it has set on improving biodiversity locally and being part of the climate declaration and climate emergency and trying to improve the natural heritage that we have on our doorstep. So I started at Kingston Council earlier this year in this new position, and I suppose there's three sort of elements to this role. One is trying to create a biodiversity strategy for the borough, which we've made some pretty good strides in this year. So a holistic strategy where we're looking at setting out the roadmap for how we can improve Kingston's biodiversity, and that will involve setting up biodiversity partnerships and stuff like that, and have this documentation and plans in place. Things haven't moved as quickly as we would have hoped, obviously, due to the COVID situation. As many people in the local authority sort of area, I was redeployed to supporting the COVID response for a good few months over summer. So that paused a bit of the biodiversity elements, but nevertheless, we have made good progress on that strategy, and hopefully early next year we'll come out with some exciting announcements around that. Another element is engaging with the planning system, trying to encourage making sure that because obviously there's significant development pressure in Kingston as any sort of urban landscape. So just trying to make sure that we're meeting all the biodiversity legislation and wildlife protective legislation that's out there, and trying to make sure we're ensuring biodiversity net gain and in our development. And it's actually a really interesting time for the policy when it comes to the environment at the moment. Last week, the Environment Bill was passed through Parliament, and I think it might have got royal assent now already, but it's basically within that come quite a few interesting measures which will help development hopefully become more environmentally friendly, which includes the mandation of biodiversity net gain, and which would be really good to see how that is applied at the local level, making sure we see these new developments that we're thinking not just of the human benefit, but also the wider environmental and wildlife benefit that might be able to bring as well, and being sensitive around that. And then the last thing that I do as part of this job is the community engagement side. So this to some extent. So trying to also raise awareness of Kingston's natural heritage. So for example, there's been so many people in the council. They've been so supportive of this. For example, the libraries team and the communications team. So we now have a regular sort of communications strategy, sending out information every week about just interesting wildlife stuff about Kingston that people might not always expect a council or library or a council to be sort of shouting about, but just trying to sort of and raise that awareness level to make people aware of the species that can be found around.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And actually, on that point, Elliot, I wondered if I could just ask you to share with our listeners your own personal views of what are like some good things that can be done to mobilize people so that they can engage in proactive conservation.
Yeah, well, there's so many things. Like everybody has power to do something, irrespective if you've got a garden or if you haven't got a garden. Very basic. The first thing that I'd always say is just go out and explore as much as you can, and just try and look up and look down, and we'll make sure when you're looking around, when you're walking around, you're not just completely glued to your phone. And yeah, just trying to just take it in yourself. And for example, this is a really interesting time of year. As we start to see birds which are escaping the northern sort of Arctic winters, and they come here to try and get a bit more of an easy ride over the winter. For example, things like redwings and fieldfares, and maybe if we're lucky, things like waxwings and hawfinches. So it's a really interesting time to be looking at birds, and it's really interesting. And then if you have got access even to your balcony or your garden, putting out sort of bird seed this time of year is really important, as we're starting, winter's quite a difficult time for in terms of food resources. So if you could put out some bird food, that's a very easy first step to do. And then other things you can do is make sure, I'm a really big believer in sort of connectivity, and not always just like looking at your little place in a sort of a silo, but seeing it as a part of a holistic whole, or being part of a small part of a bigger picture. So really encouraging sort of ecological connectivity. So if you do have a garden or anything, put like a little hedgehog hole in it, which just is 13 centimetre hole, and that will just encourage hedgehogs maybe or other creatures to be able to move through your garden and not just get trapped, and be able to sort of bring populations together. So there's so many. I could talk about this all day, but I think that they were the two sort of big, especially this time of year, the two things I would suggest.
Yeah, and that's very cool. And just on this vein of raising awareness, I would like you, if you wouldn't mind, to give us a feel about, like, in practice, how the community has already got engaged in different sort of conservation projects. I mean, you mentioned something there, 2 ideas there that are so micro-local, because every person listening to this can just crack on and do something about it. But in particular, Elliot, I wouldn't mind if you could talk to us a little bit about the Hogsmill River project. And just what was involved, and how people perhaps can be aware of other projects like that, and get involved on that as well.
Yeah. So just for clarity, for those who might not know, so the Hogsmill is one of the amazing rivers that we have in Kingston, and it's about a 9.9 kilometre river. It sort of rises in Bournehall in Epsom and flows through the sort of the backbone of Kingston and comes out just by sort of in Kingston town centre by the Guildhall. But in itself, it is an amazing habitat. So it's what we call a chalk-fed stream, because where it rises for a chalk bed, and that does loads of stuff. So it cleans the water, and it also provides a special ecology. We've only got about 200 chalk streams across the planet. So in itself, our Hogsmill River is amazingly rare habitat, so it's something we should cherish and try to look after as much as we possibly can. So and we've done a lot, as have many other charities, to try and raise the profile of it. So one thing that we did last year was we made a short little video about the Hogsmill, which you can find on YouTube, which will hopefully open your eyes to some of the species that you can find on there, which you might not expect, such as things like kingfishers and European eels, which are just amazing. But one thing that we're really leading at the moment, as Citizens Zoo, is trying to bring back an amazingly charismatic creature that has got an incredible sort of social history to Kingston, and also to the UK as well. So it's the fastest declining mammal, and that is in the UK, which is the water vole, made famous out of books such as Kenneth Graham's Wind in the Willows, where Ratty is not actually a rat, he's a water vole. And Kingston once supported a vibrant and thriving population of water voles. If you go back to 1851, when Millet, the famous pre-Raphaelite painter, painted Ophelia, the background of Ophelia on the Hogsmill, he actually included the water vole at the time because there were so many water voles in the river. He had to take it out, unfortunately, because his pre-Raphaelite brotherhood friends thought it detracted from the rest of the painting. So, but it made it in there for a short time at least. And if you go back to even 30 years ago, with volunteers on a water vole project who remember a time where they would just walk down to the river, onto bridges, and just throw bread into the water, and they had all these beaming water voles looking up at them. So this is a sort of but now the last water vole was thought to become extinct locally on our river in about 2017. So we no longer have water voles on our river. So this is a really recent extinction event, which is a real problem. So it's something we're looking to reverse. And water voles have a really important role to play in any sort of river system. Like any animal, if you imagine nature as the most amazing complex puzzle that you've ever seen, and what humans have done, and we're progressively taking out the pieces of this puzzle, and obviously it doesn't look or doesn't work as well as it would do otherwise. And part of the rewilding sort of narrative is trying to restore those sort of building blocks and pieces to make it back into a functioning system. And water vole are a very important piece of that puzzle. They're a very important prey base. They support food webs because they're quite a big vole, and they breed lots in the summer periods, and they eat 227 different types of plants, so they can spread seeds, vitally food the river system, so really important seed disperser, and they also create habitat in the banks for a whole range of species. So we're looking to try and bring back water voles, and this is a really amazing project that's garnered so much community support. So we've got over 100 volunteers just part of this project, and there's loads of ways in which you can get involved, even at the moment. So we have this whole series of going out to do sort of mammal surveys. We have these rafts which are deployed across the river in 10 different locations, which you can go and check on a weekly basis. And hopefully next year, when COVID restrictions potentially start to loosen, we can get outside and we'll be able to do some sort of good habitat restoration stuff. And just after, about a few weeks ago, in fact, we completed the crowdfunder, which was really successful, and we actually raised about £18,250 towards the project, which is amazing, which puts us in a position when we're able to, we'll put an order in for the water voles, and hopefully, if all goes according to plan, the first water vole will be back on the Hogs Mill in spring of 2022. So that means we've got all of next year to do lots more habitat restoration stuff, and then about a year's time, we can go and celebrate the water voles being back on the river.
That's so cool, Elliot. That's so cool. And I applaud you guys for that. And for our listeners, I cannot stress enough how amazingly beautiful this short documentary is that Elliot referred to. I'll make sure I add a link to it on the show notes. But in any case, just search for Hogs Mill River Project and it will come up. The filming, the storytelling, just so good, Elliot. And you know what? It actually, just like you've done there, everybody involved was so passionate, but bringing it down to sort of a plain English level, using words like indicator species and getting us to think about things like that, where, you know, an average Joe like me, whilst I appreciate the concept, I might not be thinking about that when I'm looking at nature. And you've just mentioned there again, in terms of the water vole being able to dissipate different seeds and things around his journey. And all of that, I think, just makes it even nicer to walk around a place and just be conscious of phrases and words and things that are happening that sometimes are laying just beneath the surface of just the sort of pretty bit we're looking at. So, yeah, appreciate you mentioning that. Thank you.
Oh, no, pleasure.
Elliot, what are some of the key business lessons that you've learned throughout your life?
Oh, one thing I can never really describe myself as a keen businessman, but one thing that conservation definitely is in need of is money, because I honestly think one of the most important jobs, or the most important job on the planet, must be trying to save the planet itself. And the issues that we're facing are not cheap issues. We're looking to have, you know, these are some of the most profound and significant problems, and the human race will and has ever faced, and that is going to cost money to address. And so one sort of bugbear that I've sort of have with the conservation sector generally is that it's a charity. It's predominantly funded by the charitable sector, and when you look at philanthropy, actually very little of that actually goes into the environmental sort of sector. So for you know, some of the biggest troubles of our time, we do not have the investment that is really required to overcome these significant challenges. So with Citizen Zoo, for example, we actually chose not to set that up as a typical charity, because with charities, then you get your grant in, which is great, but you might apply for 10 grants before you even get to that stage. So a lot of wasted time has gone into that. And then once your grant comes to an end, say a 3-year period, unless you've got a really robust exit strategy, it's most likely a lot of the good that's come out of the project will typically fade away. So we wanted to really try and ensure a way in which we can have like a sustainable business model to support conservation, which is so important if you're looking to have security in the sector and, you know, have that ability for growing your outputs in terms of the good that you can do, which is how we sort of see growth in our context. you need investment and sort of resource to do that and be able to be a sort of rock bed to support that. So that's why we became a CIC, we still do apply for grants, or grants are still applied for Citizen Zoo, but looking at ways in which we might be able to generate income from the more sort of sustainable means. And by no means there yet. It's something we're looking to do. Excitingly, from January, we're actually employing our first full-time hire, which is quite good for an organisation.
Cool. Cool. Well done.
It sounds like a very small thing, but for us, it's quite a big thing. So it'll be the world's first urban rewilding officer. So we're quite happy with that title, and hopefully there'll be more of those jobs being put into the conservation context moving forward. But hopefully with that chap starting in the new year, that'll give us more capacity to try and investigate options to become more financially secure, so we can grow. And I think it's another general point. Sorry, now I'm going on a little bit, but I think conservation sector is hugely criticised, and quite rightly so, for its lack of diversity. It's very white, it's very middle class, which is awful for many reasons. You want to make sure you can foster an inclusive environment with all backgrounds. And I think one of the biggest boundaries to that is because it's quite an underfinanced sector. It doesn't, if you want to get into conservation, you typically have to do a lot of volunteering. And if you're not in a position from socio and economic background to commit years of your life to volunteering, which many people aren't, I had the fortunate luxury of being able to move back home when I was younger to move in, and that gave me the opportunity to do that. But if you don't have those opportunities, it's a very, very difficult sector to get into. Then even when you escalate it, it doesn't really have the high sort of salaries at the top end that other sectors might have. So then maybe doesn't encourage some of the best people to come into the sector, because the sort of rewards aren't there from sort of a financial perspective. So I think the whole conservation sphere needs to potentially have an overview, and could learn a lot from a lot of other sort of business models to see how it could attract the best people and become a diverse environment, and also have the resources that it needs to deliver the successes we need to happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Elliot, when you look back at your career journey to date, what are you most proud of?
I don't know. I think I absolutely love. I think one thing I love doing is obviously talking to people and trying to sort of transfer some of my enthusiasm to children and to people in the community. And when I can hear people come to me and say, "Oh, Elliot, I now have a greater appreciation for the natural world around me, and I now value the world around me a bit more because of you told me something about a dragonfly or something about a spider or something." That to me is one of the best things I can ever hear. But I think in terms of a project that I'm most proud of, I spent 3 years working for a charity called the Environment Trust, and during that time, I restored the local nature reserve that I used to play around with as a child, when I used to play in as a child, which was a massively neglected nature reserve. But we built a wildlife pond, set up a friends group, did lots of river restoration, and now it's an absolutely thriving nature reserve, and it's beautiful. And I think just walking around during lockdown 1, just seeing children running around and parents coming up saying, "We had no idea this place existed until you did this," and it's made our lockdown journeys that much bit more bearable because we had this green space to go into. I think that, in terms of project, is what I'm probably most proud of.
Very cool. Very cool. Elliot, what next for you? Are there any projects in the pipeline that you can tell us about?
Well, obviously, I'm still getting my teeth into this job at the council, and I think there's so much there to happen. I really do believe Kingston can become a leading borough for how we can showcase and manage our natural heritage, and demonstrate how you can have a thriving human population living alongside a thriving wildlife population, hopefully. So I've definitely got a good few years work ahead of me trying to help support that sort of direction of travel. But there's other sort of projects that we're sort of looking into. I suppose with that hat on, Torf Court Farm, which is one of our biggest nature reserves in Kingston, 50 hectares. I think that could, if we manage to gain the resources necessary, that could be one of London's most outstanding nature reserves, applying some really interesting rewilding themes. And there's a little bit to the side of that where I think we're looking into the feasibility of if could we do a beaver trial. So beavers are not all. Well, there's been a lot of media around beavers, especially this year, because they were the DEFRA trials were approved in England, which is really good news. But now there's a growing movement to see how beavers could be applied to the more peri-urban or suburban and urban context as a way of increasing biodiversity and also reducing our chances of flood risk, which making us more resilient to the intense weather events that were happening. So,
wow.
There's a few potentially interesting things in the pipeline, which is good.
Exciting times ahead.
Absolutely.
Very cool. As we start to wrap up, I'd like to ask you a few quick fire questions that our listeners are always interested in. So, Elliot, what do you do to relax outside of the office?
It's a little bit cliche, but I just love to go for walks, and I always take my binoculars with me. So, just
very cool. And are there any books that you've recently read that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I've just finished reading 2 books, actually. One is called Rewilding, which is really good. And the other one is called Entangled Life, which is all about the amazing world of fungi that are underneath the floor. Entangled Life is something I definitely recommend.
Cool. And are there any movies or sort of TV shows that you've recently watched that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Again, I'm going to be pretty boring, but I don't know if anybody's got Netflix, if they've seen A Life on Our Planet, which is David Attenborough's witness statement. I think that's one of the most important and powerful films of our time. So we've got to jump onto that.
I second that, and I've got just so much time for David Attenborough. He just, again, one of these people who he can lit a fire with his passion about a subject, and it just, it gets you really thinking about things in a different way. So for sure, I second that recommendation. Thanks for that, Elliot. Finally, where can people go to find out more about you and your projects?
I suppose 2 places, just quickly. So obviously you can check the Citizency website, and that's got all the stuff about water voles and how to get involved with local conservation projects. But also check the council's social media for every Wednesday we do Wildlife Wednesday, and every Monday we do a little reading nature session on the library page. So check the council's social media feeds as well.
Definitely. And for the benefit of our listeners, I'll make sure that I add those resources to the show notes. Elliot, thank you for joining us here on the Inside Kingston podcast. It's been a pleasure getting to know your story.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
That wraps up another episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. Make sure to check out our guests' website, pay them a visit, and help spread the word about what they're doing. If you have any questions or know someone who should be a guest on the show, please feel free to get in touch. I would also love it if you could go to iTunes and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. We work hard to bring on some great guests, and getting a review from you is one way to help the podcast rate well on iTunes so that others can find and enjoy the show too. Thanks for listening.